Larry, how are you? I just before we even get going, I'm going to give you the option because this is going to be like one of those old school episodes. I'm going to give you the option. You can either have a really bad joke or you can have a pre-show quid pro quo. What do you want?
Well, I think first of all, I'm doing fantastic. Thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to be here. And it would be remiss of me to not take advantage of the generosity of the holiday season and politely demand both.
I, oh, we're going to do both then. Let's do both. So what do you want to have first? Do you want to have the joke or do you want to have the question?
Let's go joke first.
Okay. Here we go.
Got it. All right, start it off.
Start off with a joke. All right, we're going to do a superhero joke. So what does Superman put in his beverages?
Ooh, what does he?
Just ice.
Yes.
Justice.
Perfect. I'm going to hit you with one real quick. Let's take advantage of it.
Do it.
And is how did the assassin kill the circus?
How did the assassin kill the circus? I do not know.
He went right for the juggler.
Oh, that's
dun.
I love it.
Actually got that from a Deadpool comic. So you're welcome, nerds.
There you go. Oh my God. I'm also a fan. I don't know if people realize this, but I don't just tell these jokes. I actually really love these jokes.
It's an art form. It's a lost art form.
I love it. Go straight for the juggler.
It's great. And I guess, keeping with trend of the season, what is the favorite perhaps gift you were either given or received this holiday season? I know you said you don't really celebrate Christmas, so maybe we can polish that off a little differently as well. What is the coolest gift you heard of someone getting the holiday season?
I did when I was younger. I did a lot of Christmas. Christmas is still like a thing in my family. What's the best thing I've been given for Christmas? I'm literally going to say it was a stocking stuffer. My family used to do stockings. It was a big thing. Our aunt sewed these really huge stockings, and we would just like fill each other's stockings. Like
awesome.
We're talking like 30 small presents in these stockings. And I remember it was maybe 1991 or 1990. I forget which, but it was kind of like a 3-part present. In my stocking, Santa put a copy of the VHS copy of For a Few Dollars More, the Sergio Leone movie starring Clint Eastwood.
Yes.
In my brother's stocking, he got A Fistful of Dollars, which was the first one, which was based off of Yojimbo by Akira Kurosawa. It was basically a ripoff. Also Clint Eastwood. And then my father got the 2 VHS cassette tape of The Good, the Bad, the Ugly. So our family got the whole Dollars trilogy. It's called the Dollars trilogy by Sergio Leone.
Who doesn't love a theme gift, right?
But yeah, it was so the boys in the family, they all got these Sergio Leone movies, and they're like my favorite movies in the world. I love Westerns, but I love specifically these Sergio Leone movies.
Totally.
So for some reason, that is just when it's I literally watched or just had on in the background yesterday. It was a pretty lonely Christmas yesterday, but we're recording this on Boxing Day, 2021, and I just put on the 3 movies, and that just immediately puts me into a Christmas spirit. And I don't know, those movies are as timeless to me as any movies can be, and which is super weird because I'm bringing this up because the first time I did a comic-based episode of What Magic Is This? The person, my guest, Eric Millar, asked me the question of what my favorite movie is. And I said The Good, the Bad, the Ugly. So that's very apropos. Yeah. That's very apropos. So it's all coming around. As
totally. The swagger levels in the Bachelor household was never the same after that.
No, my goodness. It's so good. I love those films. And it's just one of those things. Christmas to me belongs to Sergio Leone. And hearing
that's an awesome correlation.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Larry. That's the best.
Thank you, sir.
Hey everybody, welcome to What Magic Is This? A podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and my goodness, do we have a show for you today. Now, a couple of things are happening with this episode. One, I wanted to end the year of 2021 with an episode that's fairly relaxed. A lot of my episodes recently have just been about really like heavy topics, really big stuff. And I've been getting a lot of emails to this day, getting a lot of emails to cover this one topic. And one of those emails was sent by one of my Patreon supporters. And so I was like, well, what better way to end the year but to give the people what they want and to have one of my Patreon supporters, which is one of the perks of joining Patreon, is there's a chance that you might get on the show. What magic is this? Woo. And let's just put all of these things together and let's just end the year on just a nice dose of positivity and sure. Fanboy out for a little bit.
Absolutely.
So
let's give him a slobber knocker.
That's right. Absolutely, for sure. So the topic we're going to be talking about today is going to be a comic book writer by the name of Grant Morrison, who also happens to be a magician. Well, specifically a chaos magician. Now, Larry, I have to ask, why do I have you on the show for this one?
Well, I'll be lying if I didn't ask myself that same question. But in all honesty, it's because, Grant Morrison to me means an incredible amount. They were very formative in my young years and developing into this gentleman you see before you today. And just an all-around positive influence in my development as a person and the way I think, the way I view the world, the way that my view of the world fluctuates and is never in a fixed position. I owe, to the likes of Grant Morrison. And I'd like to thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to, like you said, fanboy out. Because if anybody's expecting some sort of critical analysis from an unbiased position, you're in the wrong place. Because I'm going to fawn over this writer like they deserve to be fawned upon, in my opinion.
Amazing. You once said that you were a member of a online forum that was devoted to not just Grant's work, but to a specific comic book of Grant's.
Indeed, it was called. I pronounce it Barbelith, and some people say Barbelith, and we'll get into what that exactly means later. I say Barbelith because I'm a child of the '80s, and if you're a child of the '80s, you can't say a 3-syllable word that starts with B unless you're saying it like in Conan the Destroyer, Bombata. So you have to say Barbelith in the same like intonation, or else it just doesn't feel right off the tongue. So Barbelith was this it was basically an online concordance that was almost like an early version of like a Wikipedia, like a fan wiki dedicated to all the occult, conspiracy, esoteric intricities that are just stitched and woven into the narrative of the Invisibles. Like it's almost like when it first was hitting stands and individual issues, it didn't gain quite. It had a following. Don't get me wrong, but when it was starting to get collected into the collected graphic novels, it really picked up speed. So these people had the entire thing in one volume, and they could digest. They could look things up, and Grant's a sly bastard. He's putting word for word, sentence for sentence. He's rivaled only by the likes of his fellow British writers, Moore, Gaiman, Milligan, like they, he's packing it in there, and it deserved something like that. So this was a place where people could discuss everything from the references he had to Robert Anton Wilson, Timothy Leary, like Bill Hicks links were in there. It was just anything about in the raw vein of like ontological terrorism, like that. That's what was going on at Barbelith, and it was just a resource, and thankfully they did publish something that was fairly kind of loosely based on it. I believe it was called Anarchy for the Masses. It ended up being an actual published concordance for the Invisible. So the groundwork was laid with that, and it was just this. When I discovered that, it's working overnights security at a college. And I'm sitting in front of a computer for 10 hours a night, and I'm just on there, just talking about a rabbit hole, just deep diving every little thing in there, and arguing people with, well, the King in Yellow, does this represent the King in Yellow like a Chambers version, or it was just so much stuff in there. And it wasn't like a regular comic where it was just till you read a nickel and dime or toss it away. It was a hypertext kind of in like it was so self-referential, like and not in a pretentious way. It just like it required a certain commitment from the reader to kind of fully dive into. And young nerds, that's what I needed. That was the pool I needed to dip my toe in. So, went from there.
Perfect. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Invisibles further on down the line. But first, we're going to have a little bit of a disclaimer here. Now, okay. Larry and I, we're old farts. We're old dudes. Recently, in 2020, in Mondo 2000, which also kind of brings me back in a very strange way. I didn't even know that they were around anyways. Grant Morrison basically said that he has come out and says that he's non-binary. Mm-hmm. They are non-binary is what I should say. Right. So in this episode, I know for a fact, because it's already happened a couple of times with both Larry and myself, we have referred to Grant as he. Mm-hmm. This is in no way of disrespect to Grant or their work. When we try to remember to say they, we will. I will try to say Grant as often as possible.
Indeed, yes.
If he gets it there, I apologize. It's
I'm not going to take I know the onus is on me to do the work and put the work in for it. So I am. I'm not going to take the boomer excuse. Like, well, that's too hard. I'm too used to, no, not that guy. So I will put my best foot forward, and I'll try to just say Grant Morrison, because even just saying Grant doesn't sound like enough. It's like sometimes it's almost like a full title. And if you look at his their website, you can almost see like, whenever Grant Morrison is listed, it's never just Grant. It's always one word. Like show your T-shirt to display your knowledge of the existence of Grant Morrison. Love it.
Great stuff. So yes, we will try our best. And also I want people to realize that this is a show about magic. And as much as Grant Morrison is a comic book writer, we're mostly going to be focusing on the more esoteric side of his work, not so much about a lot of his their work with DC, with Marvel. There's some books that Grant has written that are a little bit stranger. And one of them being The Invisibles that was brought up earlier. So we're going to be looking a lot at Grant Morrison's magical worldview, because Grant Morrison is a chaos magician. To this day, they still say that they are a chaos magician. So yeah, unfortunately, yes, not so much heavy on the comics, although comics are going to be there.
I'm going to slip you some comic Mickeys along the way. Don't worry about it.
Absolutely. Don't worry.
And it's like, I'm sorry. I think their most articulated explanations of their magical worldviews do come in the comic form. Mm-hmm. So, and sometimes they slip them into the mainstream comics and that aren't picked up upon until many years after, after it's been out. So, and then there's some like inside baseball controversy that may, flavor certain scenarios that I could like dip into, but you're right. As far as keeping the magical current first and foremost, happy to oblige.
Perfect. So let's jump in and start talking a bit about the artist that is Grant Morrison. I want to start a little bit with the life of Grant Morrison. Now, Grant was born in 1960 in Glasgow, Scotland. Mm-hmm. Glasgow was an interesting place back in the 60s. He talks about his early life in a fairly interesting way. He had two parents that were fairly supportive of him reading comic books. His mother was never one of those mothers to say, like, you can't do this and you can't do that. She actually allowed them to flourish, basically. And he does mention quite a bit, though, that his father, Walter, was an interesting character, as Walter was very anti-nuclear bombs. Grant talks about how at the Morrison household, there were always pictures of bombs going off and anti-nuclear literature around the house. He talks about how his father would take him to nuclear sites and throw balls into the area and just go and take pictures. And if security would come, he'd say, my child had a soccer ball. So
this guy wasn't just sharing memes to raise awareness. He was out there breaking into nuclear facilities with his kid in tow. So,
exactly.
And from what I understand, his Grant's father was very jacked, like a tall, huge, big, classically just jacked dude.
That was back in the day when, they told pregnant women, drink alcohol while you have kids so that they get nice and big drink stouts so that they get that iron.
Right.
So yes, Walter, yes, apparently was a huge guy.
Yeah.
But very supportive of Grant. I believe, and I could be wrong here, but I believe Grant says that his father once took him to watch a steam train travel down tracks, and the steam train freaked him out. His child freaked Grant out so much that Walter kind of collated that with a nuclear bomb going off.
Right.
And since then, he just was like, I really want to stop this future that we're headed towards for my children. And yes, his mother apparently was a fairly interesting person. At one point, took Grant out to the night sky and pointed up at the star Sirius and said, "Guess what, Grant? This is where we all come from."
Right.
So. And then Grant
and then he says, and then she left me there with no explanation for it, just to look up and wonder.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, oh, perfect.
It's very good. And
what origin story?
Exactly. And apparently he also had an uncle by the name of Billy who was into Aleister Crowley, into all of that early 20th century occultism. And when Grant would spend time with good old Uncle Billy, he'd get regaled with these stories of magic. So it started there. From what I understand, he had it wasn't a very harsh upbringing, fairly middle class.
Right.
They supported him. He eventually went into a boys' only school, and what he thought was going to be like, okay, he can just like concentrate on his studies and his comic books. It turned into like a bit of a hell for him.
Yeah,
just no girls around.
Grant talks too about how the now those of us not in the UK may not like get the milieu of this, but the Grant always describes it as being like monochrome in Glasgow, like very drab and concrete and dark and not a lot of like vibrancy. And that he almost rebelled against that in his work later on by adding as much pop color, voltage of just, and he was a fairly accomplished visual artist as well. Like from a young age too, and still to this day generally drafts his own layouts by hand. But I'm glad you mentioned the Billy thing, because everybody's got that uncle, right? And I pride myself on being that uncle to my nieces, hopefully, as they come up, that introduces them to a certain level of healthy subversion.
Nice. Yeah, I had an uncle who, Michael Moorcock and Robert Anton Wilson books and the Necronomicon, the Simonomicon,
perfect.
Everybody has that uncle. He's the one who had all these knives, just decorated his place with knives.
Absolutely.
The best. But may we all, at least in some point, be that uncle. Or that
maybe live to see an Uncle Day, right? Like Mother's Day, like cool Uncle Day. Let's bring it about.
I hear you. Grant was apparently, he loved comics. He would draw comics all the time for himself. He was in a couple of, like, who's this young lad doing comic books? And he eventually got writing and submitted comics to a lot of small comics magazines. Eventually, as he got older, he let the comic stuff slide, and he formed he was part of a band called the Mixers, who were unfortunately about 12 years behind as far as the Britpop boom. But it's too bad. Have you ever heard any songs by the Mixers?
Only the scarce ones that make it into documentaries and like little features. But it's very it's very 60s. It's very psychedelic rock. Reminds me of like Creed Bratton from The Office's bands and music, to be quite honest. And that he was very influenced by like the mod style. Permeated all the way through. Gideon Stargrave was the alter ego he invented at this stage in his life, that then became a character in the Invisibles as an alter ego in the Invisibles later on. So it's all connected and cyclical.
It's all connected. What can you tell us about some of the early works of Grant Morrison? Yeah,
I know that he was published in a lot of local, which would be the equivalent of zines, I guess, for a while. Grant hit it the big time a little bit with some more like 2000 AD I believe there's another one just called Warrior, which was like a graphic novel publication in the UK. Grant's biggest, I believe, like commercial success at that time was Zenith, with frequent collaborator Steve Yoel on art, who would go on to draw the first the first run of the Invisibles. And Zenith was kind of like it's very prescient in that it explored that he said that the superhero was going to become pop culture, not that a superhero is pop culture, that it will be celebrity and pop culture in the future, that the pinnacle of hero worship culture will be real life superheroes. And a look around today, was he wrong? Like that was an incredible bout of prescience, because even then, like, comics were big, but this is before Keaton's Batman. Like, so there wasn't, superheroes weren't as ubiquitous as they were today. Sure, they were in every a 10-cent rack at every gas station and corner store, but you weren't seeing commercials for intellectual property too much on television, let's say, back then. And then that's how he broke into DC.
What about some of these earlier books? He did a comic book about Hitler being in the UK, based off of a story. There was stories always passing around because one of Adolf Hitler's cousins lived in England, and there's people that talked about how they remember an Adolf Hitler in London, in England at the time. And so Grant wrote a comic book about this. Fairly controversial.
And I believe, wasn't Hitler like the protagonist, like a somewhat compassionate protagonist, I believe. So everyone goes through their shock phase when they're young. They get their first little, you got to go for a little bit of shock. He had a lot of anti-Thatcher, a lot of anti parliamentarian stuff, a lot of Scottish, I don't know if it was like Scottish independence as much, it was just fuck England kind of shit.
Right.
But it was, a lot of anti-consumerist, anti-celebrity, a lot of themes that would permeate and all kind of culminate in his Vertigo work. They would come about sooner rather than later at this point.
For sure. And though it wasn't by his own doing, something occurred within the comic sphere around this time, as the Alan Moore released Swamp Thing. He took over a property that nobody, just like, this is a dead comic book. Nobody's reading this comic book. And next thing you know, it wins all of these awards. And of course, when that kind of thing happens, all of the companies go, well, what's happening over here in jolly old England? And so Grant was one of the ones that they scooped up, and they gave him, it was called Animal Man. I have not read any. What's the deal with this?
Animal Man was Buddy Baker. He was a lesser known property, kind of relegated to some, I think his last significant appearance was the first big crossover, Crisis on Infinite Earths. But Animal Man kind of was very family forward, had like his wife and kids with him, which was kind of rare, for the superhero thing. And the big thing Grant Morrison did that changed stuff was breaking the fourth wall and writing himself in as a sort of omnipotent creator character, and then giving the character of Animal Man awareness of the fact that he was a character in a narrative. And I'm going to put a pin in that phrase for 1 second, because I think that was the first start of the articulation of Grant Morrison's beyond magical, just worldview, in that all significance is narrative, and all narrative is significance, and that's going to come up later. So we'll return to that. Allow me to pretend to be intellectual for 5 seconds. And but Animal Man. Grant wasn't like the first to break the fourth wall. Like he was influenced by a lot of Silver Age Flash comics that they would do that. And in Grant's formative years were spent reading comics and just digesting them on a mass level. He was a fairly awkward teen, and that's explored in his later work, Flex Mentallo. If you check that out, there's a lot of autobiographical moments in there that he then verifies in future interviews. And with Animal Man, he kind of made it while people were around him deconstructing superheroes, he just showed you almost the futility in doing so.
Right.
They're kind of like, well, that's not the point. Like if you stare at anything and you deep dive rabbit hole anything long enough, you see its inner absurdity. But that's not the point. Like his point was that we create art to be better. Like, so why are we taking apart the very tools we're trying to use to be better?
Right.
And that frustrated Grant. So you can see that in a lot of his early Doom Patrol work too.
Right. You said something here. We have these little notes that we've been passing back and forth here online, but you say comic book Dadaism. So how does Grant figure into this?
Well, it's weird because he made Dadaism an actual kind of recurring theme in his Doom Patrol work, and it kind of expanded on the themes of absurdity as power in a weird way, is how I think about it. Like existence at its inner burning molten core is inherently absurd. If you like, the more you think of it, it's like in a microcosm, repeat any word a billion times in a row and it's going to lose all meaning and seem fucking ridiculous to you. Right. Now think about any concept for a billion, and just drill to the core of it. And Robert Anton Wilson talks about this all the time. Salvador Dali talks about this all the time. A lot of the greats. Mel Brooks talks about this all the time. Like the human experience is absurd. We fart, we poop, we love, we spit. We're just sacks of blood, cum, and pus, and we're walking around making magical shit happen around us. And that's fucking absurd. So let's celebrate that, and let's create art that bolsters that and that charges that with meaning and power, rather than take it apart. So the comic book Dadaism was him using absurdity as a weapon to triumph over evil, which it seems like almost in Doom Patrol, evil was intolerance and conformity of idea, rather than like a terrorist that's holding someone at knife point. The character Billy the Street, who is a perennial classic character.
Danny the Street?
I'm sorry, Danny the Street. Yeah.
A joke on Danny LaRue, which is
right. That's what I was getting from. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's perfect. And Morrison was one of the first to do a lot of positive representation in comic books, for the non-binary community from the get-go. This is, I think, 89 when he created Danny the Street, and it was out front about him being a non-binary individual, and in how Danny the Street was almost like a sentient philosophical landscape, that it was almost like a middle finger to the ultra macho superhero culture.
Right.
If there was a gun store on Danny the Street, it would be all like Chantilly lace gun store, to kind of like poke fun at all these hyper masculine tropes that in early, if those who weren't there, early 90s, late 80s in comic books were not the most, unless you were watching for reading Vertigo, they were, Cable from the X-Men with 46 pouches and a size 3 women's foot somehow. Like the art didn't match the action. It was just a blur of throwing everything at the wall. And the only coherence came in the supposed incoherence of this British wave of writers. And the whole Vertigo line then kind of became the place where subversive comics went, that wanted to say something that wasn't just forwarding intellectual property. It was actually saying something that someone could take home and use in their lives. Like there was no internet back then for kids like us, right? We were reading Wizard magazine, and we had to wait once a month for it to come out, and then hopefully they talked about the writer you liked.
Right.
And that's what introduced me to Vertigo, and being a kid that spent a few years in a Catholic school and was super confused and didn't really know what to think about the world. The only thing I knew was comic books. Here comes a comic book talking to me like an adult.
Right.
And here comes a comic book telling me that, like, there's way different, cooler shit out there. than this. They're like, have you ever heard of chaos magic? Check this out. Or have you ever heard of Gurgiat? Like,
Right.
there's a scene in Preacher where Jesse Custer meets Bill Hicks at a bar, and they go through an entire combo about Bill Hicks's philosophy. Like, you're not getting that in Doctor Strange.
No.
It's just not going to happen. So this whole line, this Vertigo just cracked open the comics culture to comics grabbed onto the cool counterculture at that point, with Vertigo, and then it just went from there. And it was in the UK, who's contemporaneous there in the UK at the time, Genesis Peerage, the TOPY, like all this cool shit's happening in the UK around that time, and jettisoning forth from that miasma, like Richard Mesger has the best explanation of Grant I've ever heard. A bullet with a candy coating.
That's right.
Just comes jettisoning out of that miasma and just gives us this occult comic literature, like just bursting forth. And it's I think it had a lot, as you'll see, it influenced pop culture whether it wanted it to or not.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the books that I find that isn't talked about very much for Grant Morrison. It's just kind of brought up because it was a bit more mainstream of theirs. It's basically made Grant Morrison rich overnight. Is a book that was released through Vertigo called Batman: Arkham Asylum. A great case of fantastic timing because it came out maybe a couple of weeks before the release of Tim Burton's Batman, which was, I think at the time, it was maybe the most successful movie ever made.
Right.
Hugely influential. Karen Berger, the person who started Vertigo,
God bless her,
basically called Grant Morrison and said, "Guess what? You're rich."
You got $1 a copy.
Yeah.
Which is, imagine getting a deal today where you got $1 a copy for your book. They learned their lesson then, right?
Yes.
But Grant got $1 a copy, and I think Grant's quoted as saying he sold like 130,000 copies the first day.
The first day.
So that was a great weekend for Mr. Morrison.
Yes.
Arkham Asylum it's got paintings by Bill Sienkiewicz in it. It's a tour de force. There's little to no like fisticuffs. Like it's there, but it's not like the
Killer Croc stabs Batman at one point, if I remember.
Yeah, and it's mostly this weird like march through the tarot deck, in a way. And honestly, if I don't know what copy you've been exposed to, but there's a wonderful anniversary edition that contains Grant's script in the back of it, the typed script with his script and then his red line notes to his own script.
Okay.
And it's corresponding to he draws references to Thelema in it, to the tarot, and how the different Batman villains, he mapped like different psychoses to different tarot cards.
Right.
And it but no one that read it knew that. That's the biggest thing.
They thought that just because I believe the character of Two-Face no longer uses a coin to make decisions, Two-Face uses the major arcana of the tarot deck to divine what happens. So very interesting book. I mean, hugely influential for its time, but now people I barely hear it mentioned. People still can't shut up about Grant or about Alan Moore's Killing Joke, which came a bit before. It was one of the it was visually the bigger influence on the Tim Burton movie. But
Brian Boland.
That's right. Yeah. But Arkham Asylum is the one that basically put Grant Morrison on the map. It was like, okay, Grant Morrison is here. He's in comics. And he's a force to be reckoned with, which is odd because he actually takes a step away from comics.
Right.
He decides, like, I want to see the world a little bit. And people talk about Grant. Grant would be doing some cross-dressing. He would travel around the world. He would just spend time with people. And just was trying to figure things out.
Yeah.
And,
you just want like Wanderlust, total Wanderlust. It's very envious. You're a young single gentleman with suddenly more money than you need to be having at one time, and that's the thing with Grant too, is Grant always was a seeker and was never, well, I can't speak like I know this for a fact, but there's never seems to be anything too crazy excessive to the point of danger. Like
No.
it's almost very deliberate. When Grant talks about their introduction to drugs and alcohol, it wasn't until the 30s, like
Yeah.
fairly straight edge all the way through. And then there's a story Grant themselves tell where they went to a bar and deliberately once every day and ordered a different type of beverage every day. Like today I will try beer.
Right.
And went through a couple of beers, then went home. Next day, yes, today I will try wine. And
Yeah.
I'm like, what a deliberate, like that must have been incredible to just deliberately taste the local fare that way.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it, just enriches the life. Was it then when they came to LA for that book tour? I think it was an Arkham Asylum book tour where there was some an introduction to ecstasy by one of the other Vertigo. This is just like a hearsay
I don't
tale.
know the story.
Hearsay tale.
Okay.
But something like that. But yeah, they got down, partied back then.
Yeah.
It was very high rave culture. Grant was always into raves, into fashion as expression. That's the one thing where
Shaved his head at that point. Was that when he?
yeah, and that was very almost shamanic when the way they describe it, like the shedding of the hair and then just feeling. He's like, I looked in the mirror and it looked fucking beautiful, so I knew there I was.
Right.
And I was like, yes, love lines like that. Love it.
Something occurred in these wandering years for Grant that would basically be so formative, that would be a part of their life for the next portion of their life. What can you tell us about the aliens in Kathmandu?
Well, as Grant themselves say, Grant was abducted by aliens on the roof of a hotel in Kathmandu because Grant went to Kathmandu to the roof of a hotel to be abducted by aliens. And claims he took a small piece of hashish the size of a lentil. Mm-hmm. And now here's a disclaimer. Mm-hmm. Grant, I'm gonna call you on something here, because not sure any hash in the history of the world has ever been made to make one hallucinate at this velocity, especially not one the size of a lentil. So I think something else was happening here, and perhaps it was in fact a journey to Alpha Centauri. But Grant claims that these aliens showed up and they were very much in physical description to the Terrence McKenna self-replicating, undulating machine elves. Those of you with a following in your Invisibles can look at the magic mirror that is manifested in the Invisibles, and that is what he describes as came to him, and they basically asked him, what do you want to do? What do you want to see? Where do you want to go? And he's just on a whim thought of Alpha Centauri, and they took him there. And it was like the blink of an eye. He was there overlooking everything. And then they explained to him the fucking deal, and he then took that and ran. And they gave him the total. Grant says they had a moment of, well, what am I supposed to do with all this? And they're like, put it in your shit, tell everybody. And I don't know if you want to talk about what it is now, or wait till we get to the end of the Invisibles to tell what that philosophy kind of is.
We'll wait till the end of the Invisibles. Make sure we definitely bring that up. Yeah, it's Grant talks, and Grant also has a way of explaining this now, where I don't know if they're downplaying it or what. Grant is always very hard to pin down.
Yeah, it's almost like can youthful exuberance be forgiven? Sure.
Yeah.
But I think it's the more work you do for ABC, the less you talk about your alien abduction.
Correct.
I think that's just a matter of that, which, more power to you. Don't make that money.
For sure. So this brings Grant to what is known as the Hyper-sigil trilogy. Now we're going to talk a bit more about what hyper-sigils are in a little bit, as well as these comics in a little bit. But just remember these names, the Hyper-sigil trilogy. They're going to be Flex Mentallo, the Invisibles, which we've talked about a little bit already, as well as the Filth. So this was Grant Morrison probably at their oddest, their most,
yes,
I'm going to say inspired.
Yes, for sure.
But they're wonderful. And
in Filth, the opposite, whatever the opposite of inspired is, or not. I don't know. There was a cathartic exorcism. The Filth, and it makes you feel that way as a reader, I believe, as well.
We'll talk about the Filth in a bit. I don't have too many opinions about the Filth, but I do have one. Anyways, we'll talk about it for sure. But what occurs with Grant is then it's almost like a little bit of he becomes known as the revamp guy. Comic book companies, both DC and Marvel, approach Grant Morrison after the Invisibles. They'll be like, "Hey, do you want to write this comic book? It's kind of stalled. It's not the best. And you write this comic book." And this includes one comic book that I'm just going to say, from my vantage, I like it. I don't think it's great, but people talk about this series as if it's one of the greatest series ever produced. It's called All-Star Superman. Mm-hmm. It's very, very fun. I think, this is just my opinion, I think you really have to love comics with all your heart and soul, as well as I think it's a very wonderful. There's some moments. There's a moment that made me cry in All-Star Superman, where Superman comes to a woman about to commit suicide, and he just basically comes to her and wraps his arms around her. Gorgeous. Like I'm choking up now just thinking about it.
Yeah. But have you heard the story of how they came to Superman being that way?
Yes, they met Superman. They were walking around at like a beach. And then there was a person there dressed up as Superman. This I'm not talking about this being fake. This is Grant Morrison and the artist
Mark Waid.
Mark Waid.
Mark Waid, they were discussing. Mark Waid tells the story that he was there. So Frank Quitely might have been there with Morrison. But yeah, they just said this dude was like chilling as Superman, like, but not in like the, rigid conservative Dick Tracy square jaw style, just like chilling on a rock, like just loving the rays. And so Grant looked at, said this is the shamanic moment, because they were discussing what they could possibly do with Superman to make him relevant, to make him beyond relevance, to make him resonate again. Mm-hmm. Because when Superman was created, I mean, it was people think just because he's the Blue Boy Scout now that when he was created, it was subversion in its most, core form. It was two young Jewish men making a, toying with the German idea of the Übermensch and making it into a force for good. And so it was this complete, just more monolithically important than people understand. Like Grant talks about it at length in Super Gods, and likens Superman to Zeus. Like, this S is nothing more than a stylized lightning bolt. And it said that Superman is like one of the greatest creations because it represents the peak of human compassion, of selflessness, of the ability to go do rather than not do, like to go affect change. In All-Star Superman, he was Grant's attempt to make that almost into a hagiography, right? Almost like a graphic novel that told the story in the way that the Greek myths told the story of those demigods of the day, with relevance to their daily lives, to the social climb, to the trials and tribulations of daily folk, to just human experience. And that's what Grant thought that comics at their purest form could be. And All-Star Superman was his attempt to do that. And this dude was he said the Superman they saw never broke character. And they interacted with him like,
they talked.
Yeah, they just chatted, just chat the shit. And Superman was like, so what do you really feel about Batman? And he's like, and they're taking notes, and that informed this relaxed, this more approachable, like, and quite deliberately, the art in All-Star Superman never tries to portray Superman as the rigid, chest out, arms to the side. He's all very welcoming and kind of like not collapsing in on himself, but more nurturing rather than defensive, I guess, if that's a good definition. And that's totally 100% intentional on the part of Frank Quitely, the artist.
Man has ever been, at least of anything that I've read. And I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but it actually begins with Lex Luthor killing and beating Superman. That's
Yeah.
how it starts, is Lex Luthor beating Superman. And I think that adds that's a very cool thing that Grant did there, to
Yeah.
basically have Superman dying.
Yeah.
And I think it is one of those books where there's a lot of characters that come up a minute that I was like, I have no idea who this villain is or who this
Yeah, a lot of
character
them were
is.
invented for that specific book, like
Okay.
Quintus, I believe
Yeah.
the super mathematician
Yeah,
scientist. Yeah,
yeah, but it's definitely worth a read. I would definitely say, and compared it to what
sure.
else was. I think there was another All Star. It was All Star Batman that was put out at the same, which is a horrible piece of
Oh
garbage.
my god, yeah, it's Frank Miller at his Frank Miller-est.
Yeah, and stick with All Star Superman, I'd say.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. That's no star Batman to me.
no,
Yeah, I love it though. Very, very 12 labors of Hercules ish.
right?
Uses kind of like the scaffolding of Greek mythology and the hero structure, the Campbellian hero structure, almost like in reverse though. In the case of All-Star Superman,
Sure.
it's also famous for having the most succinct and poetic depiction of Superman's origin story in one page, the very
Yeah,
first page. It's a master class in comic book storytelling for sure.
absolutely, definitely. Now, as I said, because of not just All Star Superman, but other projects he was involved, Grant was involved in, became the revamp guy. There's a couple of books here that I'm not too aware of, but you've got me written. So tell me about Final Crisis, written by Grant.
Woo! Final Crisis had a big effect on both Grant, the comic book industry, and the readers. It was incredibly divisive. For those that don't know, DC's main big, huge knockdown, drag them out, brawl crossover was Crisis on Infinite Earths in the 80s, drawn by the inimitable George Perez, who cancer, by the way, for the George Perez, not doing too good. Love that
No,
guy though.
yeah,
Tangent Larry here. The Final Crisis was Grant's turn at a crisis. So DC kind of had a crisis every couple of years. There was Final Crisis,
right,
Infinite Crisis, Crisis on Infinite Earths, and these various iterations went through, and it always was some big multiverse, world-spanning crossover. And so Grant used it as an opportunity to slip some crypto Gnosticism into DC's main flagship crossover.
right,
And in doing so, split the fan base like the atom. And the negative press and the people complaining that it was too obscure, too
right,
esoteric, really affected Grant. But in a nutshell, Final Crisis, Dark Side, the big specter of death, the big evil of the DC universe, kind of manifests through this Tree of Life-esque planes and into the DC universe and ends up winning. Without going into the many ludicrous twists and turns of it, Superman is kind of tasked with, in a separate mini series that goes along with it, called Superman Beyond 3D, in which Grant Morrison wrote, which came with 3D fucking glasses when it came out, and art by Doug Mahnke. It was wonderful, but it made no sense to people who didn't know Grant Morrison.
I got it.
If you knew Grant Morrison, you saw this and you're like, I cannot believe Warner Brothers gave them their $1 billion keys. It gave it's to let them do this. But
Right,
to me, like, what I think it's trying to say is that Grant says before that life plus significance equals magic.
correct.
And in this, it's almost like magic, like life plus time equals narrative equals magic.
Right,
One of the more poignant scenes is this big manifestation of this vampiric entity that feeds on the stories of the worlds. Says something to Superman like, "What will be engraved on your tombstone?" As he's like, trying to kill him, and Superman kind of does a little badass move and etches it with his his powers, and it says, "To be continued."
Oh,
And
shit.
it's like, oh, that's such a powerful just sock in the face of narrative. Like Grant holds narrative, the ability to create narrative as the pinnacle of human achievement almost.
Yeah.
And the ability to use that narrative in world-changing powerful ways.
Mhm.
And he believes that they believe that the comic book form is one of the more potent tools to do that on a mass level. Final Crisis kind of ended with, the typical comic book deaths and whatnot, but it ended with Superman singing a vibratory note in this mega machine that he created with with all these other Morrison concepts mashed in,
Right.
and it became this tale of like almost like the whole Gnostic, like matter is a trap.
Right.
Vibrate yourself out of it by having higher ideals than matter.
Right.
Um, and a lot of people thought it was bananas and absolutely ludicrous, and they weren't wrong. It was just Morrison. It was
Right.
Grant fucking Morrison, showing the world, how the DC world would end, and then how it would redeem itself. And the fact that he was able to articulate this crazy esoteric concept of words as spells, as reality, as changing reality, as using characters as sigils in and of themselves to enact change in the world. And I didn't think it was flawless by any means, but I thought it was what the comic world needed at the time. And they needed to sit down and think about shit.
Right.
Get your shit together, guys. Just sit down, stop moving so fast, think about what would really happen if the culmination of all these baser instincts were to take hold. And this is it, and it's not pretty. So let's not do that, guys.
You say here that this multiverse stuff is basically all Grant's fault. It's so.
And that's
This
kind
is
of like,
multiverses are basically the reason I've stopped paying attention to comic books in the last like 15
yes.
years. Like
And you're
I'm
saving
done.
yourself.
I'm done. I can't.
But he did it, in a way that was Grant was groundbreaking in that he made it not about the multiverse, but about the infinite potential of narrative. If your story's about the multiverse, it's going to be stupid. But if you're using the multiverse to tell a human story, maybe you can get somewhere. And I think that's where Grant shines. Is even he's a candy coated bullet. He's got this core of truth that's wrapped in this psychedelic.
Mhm.
I think I called. I said, so Grant Morrison is if David Bowie and Phil Hine had a kid that was raised by Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, and Jack Kirby.
Yes,
That's
true.
who Grant Morrison would be to me. And we'll get more into the
Yeah.
dichotomy that is Moore and Morrison later. But
Yes, we will.
I just see him as the more positive side, and I think that's why he gravitates towards Superman. There's some articles circulating now on the internet from the past week or so where that it kind of say that Grant had to take a stand in the DC editorial offices when they wanted to go and make Superman a little more like hard-nosed, fascistic, like use my power to instill order. And I agree with Grant 100%. That's not the fucking point.
No.
That would be like taking a can opener and trying to start a fire. It's just you're not using the right tool for the right job. It's completely wrong.
Yeah.
It's not the fucking point. Like, and so Grant's even later Superman work still reflects that. Now he sees Superman as sort of like the hip progressive dad that's
Right.
fostering his kids' activistic natures. Like the main Superman in the books now is his son, and Grant's kind of like got a old man Superman. He's got some Reed Richards style gray going.
Right.
That's makes
Yeah.
it's right in tune with the times.
For sure.
There's some great quotes here. I just got to say
Definitely.
that from Superman Beyond and Final Crisis that just are so Grant, and you'll know it as soon as you hear it. One of the the wise folk tells the vampiric evil nature, there are no dualities, only symmetries.
Okay.
So that's not a line you'd think would be uttered during a superhero supervillain
No.
knockout brawl. And then at one point Superman exclaims, I'm inside a self-assembling hyper story. And it's just so Grant Morrison right there for the character to be aware he's in a self-assembling hyper story.
There you go.
It's beautiful. That's comic book magic.
For sure. Now Grant is basically, they're still working quite a bit. It's comics all the way through. Sure. Although Grant has been involved in several TV series, one by the name of Happy, as well as Brave New World. They didn't last very long.
No. And I'm not sure how true to the Aldous Huxley work that his Brave New World show was. I never saw it, but
no.
But I know that he's, he did kind of gravitate towards some more Hollywood stuff while taking, one or two books on it at a time. Mm-hmm. He just most recently wrapped up a Green Lantern run that he turned it into like a police procedural.
Yep.
It's pretty cool.
For sure. And that's basically where Grant is now. Still writing, still working, always busy. People talk, when they talk about Grant Morrison, is that they work 18 to 20 hours a day. They're just constantly working, and lives somewhere in Scotland with their wife, and they're just doing their things. They have a cat.
Yeah. Oh man, speaking of cats, he when he lost his cat, that's where the filth came from.
Oh, is that so? I didn't know that.
And that's why, like, when his cats, when Feely's cat's going through all that shit in the filth, it was kind of concurrent to when Grant's cat was. There's a I think it was in that Talking with Gods, if I'm not mistaken, where Grant talks about seeing his cat like with cancer walking around and barely able to drag itself around, and that kind of info. And if you read the filth, you can see that it's the compassion for the cat is one of the only compassions that exists in the entire comic.
Well, let's talk about the thing that Grant is mostly known for, and this is called the Hyper-sigil trilogy. Now, I just need to make everybody aware of what a hyper-sigil is, and if people have not yet listened to my episode on sigils that I did with Keats Ross from Prague Magic, it is basically this: an idea of a piece of artwork, whether that be a poem, a dance routine, a diary, a comic book, a novel, any kind of art that is long form, in which you inject pieces of your current reality and the things that you would like to see occur within the future, and in some cases, things that have happened in the past, and bring them all together to basically, in a way, write your reality or create your reality. Now, this sounds like some really strange and weird stuff. Grant Morrison is the one that basically came up with this idea of the hyper-sigil. So by that, I mean that Grant would, over this period of 3 different comic titles, would inject their life into the comics, and then strangely the things would happen. So let's go through these 3 specifically. The very first one is Flex Mentallo, which I literally read for the first time maybe about 6 days ago. It's an interesting one. I'm not going to say that you need to know a ton about comics to read this one, but there is some kind of stuff like, I don't understand what's going on here, but it seems very interesting. What do you think of Flex Mentallo?
It's like basketball diaries interspersed with The Boys from Amazon Prime. It's basically the story of Grant's puberty. A lot of the things that happen to the main character in there happen to Grant themselves.
A sickness.
And Grant tells that story of being in the hospital with the sickness as a child, and like the sedative had worn off, and he woke up in the middle of the night, and in this just like kind of ward, and the only thing they could see was this glowing green light.
Right.
And he kind of viewed it as a almost like an initiatory experience of sorts, and thought, well, if I could just survive this night of that green thing scanning me, I'll be fine.
Right.
And those scenes are in Flex Mentallo, and there's it's almost like we were saying earlier, it's a reaction to the superhero universe having to be so dark and gritty and realistic. Grant thought there was no point in injecting realism in your comic books because there's already enough realism in the real world, and that's not what these are for.
Right.
And one of the most telling lines about that is towards I think it's issue 4. He says, "Only a bitter little adolescent boy would confuse realism and pessimism." And if that's not a little shot across the bow to Alan Moore, I don't know what is. But so just writing that in there, and the story of Flex Mentallo is that he's a creation of the main character, who's sort of an analog for Grant, who ends up it's hard not to spoil it, but it's been around for fucking 30 years. So it's the superheroes world was the real world, and this world we inhabit now is the fictional one that was created so that they could escape in. And it's sort of this like big it's framed in this guy who's having some sort of hallucinatory overdose. That's also that I if I'm not mistaken, Grant experienced some sort of like dark night of the soul on drugs like this once before. And then it kind of allowed the framework for it. But it's again, it's artwork by Frank Quitely, who, I mean, Morrison and Quitely, iconic duo, you know, they're the McCartney and Lennon of the comic book world. It's very meta. You know, people throw that term around loosely these days. It's like everything's meta, but it's referential in that it's referential in more of an homage fashion than a critique, but it also does have a very loud and clear message for the dark and gritty Frank Millers of the world who are trying to make comics as violent, like the Punisher style comic books, that you're squandering this gift.
Right.
Is basically what Flex Mentallo was saying.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. There's no real bad guy except for some character that just throws bombs every once in a while, don't really do anything.
Yeah, I think it was the bombs can't destroy objects, only concepts.
Only concepts, yeah. It's very, very strange. Yeah, it's an interesting ride. Which leads us into the thing that correct me if what do you think? Because you're a big fan. Let's fast forward 50 years into the future. You and I were in our 80s. Is the Invisibles going to be the thing that Grant is remembered for?
In circles, in the illustrious circles we tend to find ourselves dipping our toe in, yes.
Yeah.
In the long run of intellectual property, I think, you know, when you wiki him 100 years from now, his X-Men, his Superman, his big corporate shit will come up first, only because they sold more and therefore they're being clicked more. But as far as like resonance, I think by far the Invisibles will have the longest lasting. I mean, as long as the Matrix is still making money, I'd say that the Invisibles has the largest effect on the world. And you know, who's to say what the, you know, other Hyper-sigil effects on the world will be, but you know, it's often imitated, never duplicated.
For sure.
You know, the Invisibles were the first real info dump done well in comic form. It's like Finnegan's Wake in a comic, you know. It's very it's interactive.
I don't know if Grant would like you saying that about this.
So I only say that because I hear Raw always, Robert S. Wilson always says like Finnegan's Wake is this interactive like hypertext, and so like Invisibles is like that. It's almost like I picture like an old school 1950s switchboard with all the different like aux plugs in it, and like that is the different ways you can use to draw connections between the Invisibles within and of itself.
Okay, you've got 1 minute to explain the plot of The Invisibles to people that have not read it.
It is the initiatory journey of a young Dane Whitman as he joins a cadre of freedom fighters who work for an organization called the Invisible College, which is battling the manifestation of dark archons from an alternate parallel reality, which are feeding on our reality to sustain their own and causing all of the ills and strife in the world while they do so. This is a peek behind the curtain. It's the Illuminatus for the 1990s.
Fucking beautiful. You nailed it.
I need a little sound effect after that, like an explosion.
I'll give you something. I'll give you something. That's
But
great.
yeah.
Yeah. It's a hell of a comic book. It's one of the first comic books that I remember reading. And I was one of the ones that, I didn't get it until after I found out who Grant Morrison was. I was not following it at the time, but
did it make you look stuff up?
oh, of course.
Yes. Yes. And that's what I think the beauty of it is it made you go on that journey.
So stop us if this sounds familiar, listener, but it starts with a young man, a man who is suddenly given a peek behind what reality exists by an older, wiser gentleman, and who tells them that there is a group or some force that is basically trying to enslave and keep everybody in subjugation. And then eventually they join this other group and they learn new skills and they do battle with, was it Sir Miles is one of the great villains.
All
great
in leather.
Yes. Yes.
Lots of guns, lots of leather, lots of sunglasses.
For sure. It's a comic book that, yes, the references come thick and fast, and it's really quite wonderful. So what does Barbelith mean?
Well, I don't know if that's ever been 100% nailed down from from Grant's mouth, but there's a couple different competing theories, right? The one I tend to ascribe to is that Barbelith is some sort of benevolent extra dimensional placenta that is like exists outside of Earth, and it kind of, I think it hides in the dark side of the moon, like, or something like that, or in that general vicinity. It seems to be related to some sort of like extra dimensional or extraterrestrial intelligence, and it basically is it takes the place of the red pill, blue pill in the Matrix, where once you pass through or you interact with Barbelith, it's you're different, you're invisible, you're one of the invisibles after that. And the thing is it appears different forms to different characters throughout the series, which is another great thing. And so some people, to like in the beginning, to Dane, it appears as like a giant, like psychedelic Saturn, and to one of the some characters later in the book, it's straight up alien abduction experiences. And I've heard another theory put forth on someone that I heard talking about the other day that said it scanned you to make sure you were at the right place in space and time, and if so, it went green and you got continued, and if not, it put you back until you were. So that's cool, and I might have to do another reread to see if there's like some more evidence of that. But is it Wizard of Oz and Pink Floyd? I don't know, but we'll see. Right.
It's a very crazy comic book. It's definitely worth a read for everybody. It's odd, though, because the one issue, and I wrote it down in the notes that I was giving you, but the one issue that actually struck me the most doesn't involve any of the main characters you know about, doesn't have King Mob, which is kind of the Morpheus character. If we're going to use the Matrix as a correlate.
Morrison-Pheus, Grant Morpheus.
There we go. By the way, just so people know, the Wachowski brothers, who they were the brothers at the time, but when they were making the Matrix, they would just leave the copies of the Invisibles just around the set, just for while they were making the movie.
Steve Skroce, one of the artists that worked with DC Comics at the time and was definitely around them, was the storyboard and production designer on the Matrix. And in the new Matrix, I believe he plays a barista. They give a little like cameo, I think. I could be mistaken. I just know that they said the name Skroce to the character, but it was saddled with a little bit of production issues when it first came out at times. And there was if I remember, there was like a little controversy with the last issue, because the last issue was kind of drawn by all the like he like took the artists that kind of went on the whole run with him.
Yeah.
And let them draw a portion of the book, the last
Right.
the last one. And I guess one artist in particular did not do Grant's explanation justice. And to be
No.
fair, I think it was the big reveal of his
Right.
like philosophy. So I mean, I can't say that it's an enviable task for the
No.
artist to be asked to draw that in the first place, but it I mean, something must be said for the art and the Invisibles. It does kind of run the gamut between, you know, decent comic book art and fucking amazing. Phil Jimenez, who drew the bait, this when they're going in into the base and they're doing like the extraction of the stuff in the base. Like Phil Jimenez has just become one of the most incredible artists in comics today. So shout out to Phil. But yeah, Invisibles just changed me. Like I felt myself change.
The comic that really struck me though was one, as I mentioned, is one involving the life of a soldier who is shot in one of the first issues. Grant actually has a whole comic book called Best Man Fall, in which it goes to explain just the circumstance of a comic book character that's just, you know, he's just another one of those.
He's a cannon fodder. They just,
exactly,
you know, yeah,
exactly, cannon fodder. But it actually goes through the struggles and the hopes and the dreams of this one soldier that is killed by one of the main characters in the Invisibles.
And it's a remarkable single issue. Even if you knew nothing about the Invisibles and you just read that issue, it's so. I mean, I think
I hated it when I first read it, and then I'm like, wait, that's actually maybe one of the most genius things I've read.
Yeah, you hated it because you didn't want to feel that sort of empathy for a fucking henchman. You know, they're just the guys that get shot, and you don't pay it. He's an extra in the movie, but then what happens? Like Grant is a master of that. I will say, like, of just zooming in on the between seconds moments, and deep diving in those and showing you this emotional resonance, like. That like I think he had like a disabled child and the only reason he got like wrapped up into this weird paramilitary group was to provide for this disabled child, and then you know the quote unquote hero of the comic shoots this dad in the face. And so it's kind of like how he kind of challenged. You probably hated it the same way I reasoned, like, man, I've been cheering these guys' deaths for fucking 20 years, and there's a human being underneath one of those, and that's where I think Grant shines, is just showing you that, you know, to quote the Muppets, peoples is peoples, and we're all just giving it our best shot. We're all awash in a lake of suffering every day, and it's up to you whether you decide to, you know, try to bucket out some of that water or add to it. So and I think the Invisibles is a roundabout way to show that we are in control of that. We can choose that rather than choose to put the microscope on the grim and dark. Let's put it on the on the Technicolor,
for sure.
And you know, the pride and the hope of just everything of his is about having a set fate, but being able to overcome it by being human. And that's what resonates with me. One of my favorite sentences, I'm sorry if I'm just fucking babbling like a maniac. One of my favorite quotes from Grant that I think, and I'm going to dedicate this to the What Magic Is This Patreon. Shout out to all my peeps. It's spoken by Tom O'Bedlam during Dane's initiation, and it's sorcerers have to be warriors. We don't lie in our beds waiting for old death to come sidling up in his cap and bells when we least expect it. No, we go and knocking on the bugger's door, and when he opens it, all surprised and sleepy-headed, we leap past him and out.
That's right.
And oh God, I read that shit and I just want to fucking go jogging. You know, it just pumps you right up.
Absolutely. There is some magic within the Invisibles. As I said, it was a hyper-sigil for Grant. So as Grant was creating it, he was noticing. Grant, at one point, he noticed that he was a little bit lonely. He was in need. They were in need of some companionship, and began to introduce characters that they might like to have involved in their own life. Grant introduced certain characters and started to notice that these characters in real life, they would start to appear and make themselves known to Grant. And another instance where Grant was writing one of the characters by the name of King Mob, who's the kind of like the leader of the Invisibles. At one point, is interrogated and tortured by Sir Miles, the kind of like quote unquote bad guy of the Invisibles, or one of them. Grant became immediately incredibly ill as he was writing this character. And at one point, Grant was actually close to death. He was fighting, I believe it was some kind of an infection or.
Yeah, it was basically this. I think it was the same like necrofasciitis type infection that he had said was injected into King Mob.
Right.
And it had, I guess, in King Mob, it had traveled and collapsed King Mob's lung in the actual comic, and then Grant himself had got his lung collapsed by the infection.
Yes.
And then I think, I don't know if this is the part, but I think he said that that's when he had interacted with some voodoo Loa spirits who said to get a tattoo of a scorpion on your lower back to get rid of all this. And so he gave it to King Mob, and then everything cleared up.
Everything cleared up. Yeah.
It's fucking crazy.
It's ridiculous. So when I say hyper-sigil, this is an example of it. And at one point, Grant was just like, I need to get out of this. And he wrote himself and this character that was basically the representation of Grant within the comic. King Mob was Grant Morrison. Yes, he's like, I should probably maybe make my character be okay, and wrote it, made it okay. Yeah. In the later months of 1995, The Invisibles was going to get canceled. It was going to be canceled by Vertigo. Sales were not very good. So in the back of the 1995 issue of the November issue of The Invisibles, Grant Morrison asked the readers to draw the sigil that he had drawn himself, Grant had drawn it, or themselves had put in the back of the comic book, and to masturbate. And then at the moment that each of them orgasm, to have the sigil that Grant drew in their minds to save the comic book. And apparently it worked.
Yeah.
It worked. Because
can't argue with those results.
Yeah, so that was at the very end of what is considered volume 1 of The Invisibles. And it was, The Invisibles went on for another two more volumes. So 3 volumes.
Last one was a countdown too. It was like 12-1. So that was pretty nifty. Right.
I got to ask, though, do you think that we're still going to be talking about The Invisibles in another 20 years? Do you think it still stands? Have you read it recently? I've read The Invisibles all the way through, I think twice in my life.
I think that I would be the least unbiased person to say it. Like, it will for me. I know that. Like, I probably give it a reread every couple years, just because. And like what'll happen is I'll come across a concept and I'm like, that reminds me of something in the fucking Invisible, and I'll go back and like, oh my god, another thing I missed or didn't get in the first read through. Like, so like layer upon layer. And so in that respect, it should. But I think it suffers from the thing that all kind of subversive works suffer from, in that they have less notoriety than their mainstream derivatives.
Right.
So I think that, the Matrix will for sure forever have an impact. And then, so I guess by the transitive property, The Invisibles does too. But I know a college professor that brings The Invisibles into his to one of his classes. So
very cool,
for like a graphic novel as literature class. So the hope is there. I think it's going to be I think it will always be relevant in the, in the chaos magic current sort of communities. And just like Morrison purists. But I wish it was in the conversation of the overall DC Comics more, the same way that like Hellblazer is.
Right.
And like how like Constantine's fairly ubiquitous now as in DC Comics, as far as being, you can see, you're not going to see King Mob show up in Superman.
No.
So that I think is going to be is where it's going to kind of, I don't want to say obscurity, but it won't be as well known as the other ones, and that's a goddamn shame.
I think if magic, I'll put it this way, this is what I'm going to say for all the listeners. if you think the idea of creation of art as magic and how it can impact one's life, there literally is no better example than the Invisibles.
Yes.
But only if you have it tethered to the knowledge of what was occurring in Grant's life and where Grant came from.
Right.
In that sense, I think that it is a wonderful, wonderful document. And
Yes.
depending on how you view the world, whether it's a bit more Gnostic or
Right.
not, or whether you view the world through a conspiratorial lens, that's up to you to decide. It could be perhaps the way that you see the world, but I think that it is just it's a great slice of art. It just is a wonderful slice
Yeah.
of art and magic.
I
And
think it shows to what the medium of comics can accomplish when
yeah,
done deliberately with someone with the I think there's something to be said for Grant's intentions in
right.
writing these stories too. You can feel, like, I hate to use the word exuberance, but
Mhm.
you can feel just his exuberance for the medium of comic books,
Yeah.
and how he sees the innate power just in the juxtaposition of images. Like he we you and I talked about Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which I
Mhm.
think I think anyone who does any sort of sigilization or any sort of art as magic or uses any sort of uh you know I guess art in their practice at all could stand to read Understanding Comics, because it is a comic book that teaches you why comic books work the way they do in such a fourth wall breaking way that like when I read that book, it's one of those books too where, like, you read that book, you got to go sit with like a cup of coffee somewhere and just look at a tree
I agree. It's a
because you're
really it's a mind fuck of a book.
yeah,
It's a really
just
great book.
what he was able to accomplish with the comic medium.
Absolutely.
It's like it that was magic. And I think, like, just if you read Understanding Comics and you read Condensed Chaos and then you read The Invisibles, you can create a graphic novel grimoire.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I want to see somebody do that. So fucking someone take that challenge up.
I'd throw Jan Fry's visual magic in there as well. If you got
Oh, nice.
those four, I think yeah, you could definitely have some magical visual magical juice, or even just they're massively inspiring, and I think that that's one of the other things about The Invisibles is that it reads as an inspired work,
Absolutely, yeah.
and it is inspiring itself as well.
It's like it's almost like Grant was discovering these things alongside you and just saying,
Yeah,
"Look how fucking cool this shit is," but
absolutely.
in a way that wasn't preachy, that wasn't proselytizing, and he never made you feel less than for not knowing it before him. Like, does that make sense? Like,
Yes, it does. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
it,
The
he's very
character of the
great.
Marquis de Sade is just in there. You don't need to know
Yeah.
about the Marquis de Sade. It's
And he's
just there.
cool. He's
He's
a nice
cool. Yeah,
dude.
yeah,
Yeah.
he's nice.
Sure, he's a sexual deviant, but that's
But
behind closed doors. But he's,
whatever.
and actually, Danny Lowe might appreciate that chapter too, because I believe the Marquis de Sade ends up making a swimming pool of orgone energy
That's right.
at the one Invisible's compound. So
That's
shout out
right.
to Danny.
There we go. That's I think the thing about the Invisibles is that it is for my money the greatest example of a hyper-sigil.
Sure.
It is the hyper-sigil, right? Like
Right.
it's what Grant invented the hyper-sigil for.
Right.
He says, of course, or they say, of course, that Flex Mentallo was part of the trilogy, but the best encapsulation of hyper-sigil
Absolutely.
is definitely
I feel like
yeah, it's gotta
I
be
feel like
Invisible.
Flex was Grant's personal, like, he needed to put that comic.
Correct.
They
Yeah.
needed to put that comic out to move beyond the
Mhm.
that conundrum within
Right.
themselves. And I think too, like, one thing I wanted to say about the Invisibles is it put forth a trans character to the front and made
Mhm.
them a hero long before I saw any other medium doing so, whether that was pop culture, whether that was television, movies, books. I mean, great, being a a kid
It was in like the
from Rochester, New York.
seventh issue or something like that. It was like right in the very beginning of the
Yeah,
run.
and let me tell you what, like, as a young teen, like, I wasn't exposed to that, facet of, the human culture. And I didn't know what was going on there. And Grant showed me that here's a character you can care about. Here's a human being
Right.
under this label.
Mm-hmm.
And Lord Fanny became
Lord
one of
Fatty.
my favorite characters in the entire comic.
Uh-huh.
And, and from there gave me a knowledge of a community that didn't exist, a community of humans to interact with that I had no idea about. And I think Grant had such a compassionate and just fucking badass portrayal
Mm-hmm.
of a non-binary individual that was well beyond its time. There could be many other characters I'm just not aware of at that time that came
Right.
out, but in my money, as far as my experience, that it was, Grant Morrison it was Lord Fanny, it was Danny the Street, it was these concepts that he kind of took. He prides himself in taking like an Island of Misfits toys approach, sort of, and like taking the underrepresented in society and showing them to be the heroes and showing them to be something to aspire to rather than react to, if
Right.
that makes sense. Like
100%. Yeah.
yeah. So, and I fucking love Grant for that, for opening my eyes to something like that at a young enough time in my life. I'm 40-year-old nerd now. So that was 20 some years ago, an undisclosed number of years ago, when I first discovered these. And, I can honestly say it made me it enriched me. It enriched my life having access to a comic book that it was so just was so thick,
Yeah.
and just had so much tooth and was just juicy, in a way that even more stuff was, although it was just as dense, it wasn't a hug like Morrison's stuff was. Moore's was a we'll
Moore's
get
always
into
feels like
that.
you're always sitting in class when I deal with Moore, which is okay.
Yes.
I always feel like
Yeah,
I'm sitting in
sure.
class. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sure. It's just a different interaction. Grant's like looking in your eyes and telling
Yeah,
you a fucking deep love story.
for sure. Which is strange because Grant's next project, if Flex Mentallo and the Invisibles is the climb up the mountain, the way down is a comic called The Filth,
Yes.
which is after I read The Invisibles, I literally went straight to get The Filth, and
Yeah.
I don't think I made it all the way through.
Yeah. I mean, Chris Weston crushed it art wise.
Yeah,
Fucking beautiful. It it is rendered in detail you wish it wasn't.
right.
As you go through. Yeah. To I think what it's very what's it, Blakean, and like it's like the road to enlightenment is paved with excess
Yeah,
sort of deal. The
yeah,
Filth, where it's unless you put yourself through the absolute bottom, unless you interact with the underbelly of the underbelly, you don't know human experience, and you don't. There's a facet you're denying yourself,
yeah.
and the Filth kind of revels in that that brown area, gray area. I don't know.
Brown area is fine. Yeah,
It's challenging. I'll
yeah,
give
it
it
is.
for
Yeah,
sure. And in Grant's real life, they were dealing with the death of a beloved pet, which is reflected in the story. And it just it's very hard to pin down and to kind of give a concise definite. What is the Filth? Now, the Filth is a comic book about a porn addicted guy who and from there it's almost impossible to tell you what it's about after that.
Status. There's a name of a group called like Status Q. No,
Yeah, Status Q. You're right. Yeah,
it is Status Q. Okay,
yeah,
yeah,
and or no, they're called the Hand, and they
the hand.
enforce a mandate called Status Q.
Right,
Yeah,
right. Yeah,
and that he's a para personality
yeah.
for a sleeper agent. What they do is they create personalities upon personalities, and he was like in deep cover. Yeah, it's just it's a very weird exploration of identity in that way too, like assuming different identities to do certain levels of dirt, I guess I would say it,
Yeah.
and compartmentalization sort of deal. But it's gory. There's a lot of like boobs and poop and
Yeah.
wieners and just fucking shit flying around. It's gross, but it's almost like Bukowski-ish
Yeah.
in a way, like where it's like a celebration of the you know, who's that, what's that Diane's, that photographer, Diane Orbis, is that her name? Where she like focuses like the on like the homelessness of New York City and stuff, but it'll make it beautiful.
Yes.
And that's kind of like what the Filth is. Yeah, it's a microscopic celebration of the vile and how that, you know, your shitty side just may save you. You know, and you can't. You have to acknowledge that it's there and you can't ignore it.
Right.
Don't necessarily nurture it, but just know that it's there and it can be interacted with.
For sure. It's odd that he chose. Why do you think he chose that as to be like the last of what he considers what the Grant considers the Hyper-sigil trilogy?
I think it was a cautionary tale. Like if we continue on this path of consumerism and disposable everything with disposability from because I think Grant views like pornography as like a disposable relationship.
Right.
Like, and that's sort of like the danger of such. There's a danger to accessibility and instant gratification and not acknowledging the dark side of things and the underbelly's underbelly. And if you ignore him, this would be the culmination of the world sort of deal. I mean, that's just me. I'm sure that people will come. That's the beauty of a Morrison comic book is, you know, who's right, who's wrong.
For sure.
Yeah. It's, you know, it's a comic book about I mean, I don't even want to go into detail about certain scenes in the Filth because out of context, I could just picture one day I'm at a job interview and someone plays that out of context. But yeah,
I don't know. I have yet to finish it. I don't know if I ever will. Maybe I will. You know, you never know.
And what do you remember? What issue? I think it's 13 issues. Do you remember what issue you petered out on?
I think I petered out of like issue 4 or something like that. Yeah, I was like,
it gets crazy. Yeah, it gets more bonanza. I mean, yeah, it's there for if you need it.
It's there. Sounds good.
In case of emergency, break glass. Phil can be there for you.
Now, my exposure to Grant's work actually didn't come through any of Grant's comic books. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something called the Disinfo speech. Now, this is basically the big one, and I've talked about this on other people's podcasts and a little bit on my podcast, but I'll end on the note a little bit later, but I just want to share a small segment of this because perhaps, Larry, you've also seen this speech as well, but there was a company called Disinformation. They were mid-90s to the end of the early 2000s. They were a multimedia company, mainly a website. They also produced books for towards the end of their existence, but they were a almost apocalypse culture and counterculture website that just wanted to involve all of the most interesting thinkers of the 90s, the misfit thinkers. Sure. And at one point in 2000, they put on what was called Disinfo, which was a 12-hour, it was all day in New York. It was a 12-hour symposium of figures like Marilyn Manson these days.
Yeah, right.
But Kenneth Anger, the filmmaker.
Yes.
There was Douglas Rushkoff, the multimedia and just basically Team Human podcast host these days. Robert Anton Wilson was the last speaker. And then the second speaker of that entire day was Grant Morrison, who walked up to the mic, screamed in it super loud, and then proceeded to tell everybody that to watch out because at some point in the next hour, he's going to come up on some kind of drugs.
It was LSD.
It was LSD, yeah.
Yes. And, you know, in commemoration for that, I was going to do the same, but I decided, you know, for recording's sake that I would hold off for now.
Grant basically in this speech, it's about an hour long, takes you through how he arrives at ideas. He does a crash course on sigil magic, the idea of what is natural and unnatural, and that there is no such thing as something that is not natural.
Right.
It is, in my opinion, maybe one of the most succinct examples of where magic stood in 2000. It was
crystallization. Yeah,
exactly.
For sure.
It is about as great as you can get. And
I know that my first email to you ever was discussing that. And I was like, yeah, that's how I got started in this whole shebang and down this fucking rabbit hole we're on. This was from that same speech. And I actually watched it a couple days ago too, just to refresh. And it's like, that's for if you can get past the Scottish brogue, that's the most, like you said, succinct. Like I would hand that to people to say, if they said, what are, before the question even got out of their mouth, well, what is this? Here, watch this.
Here, watch
Come
this.
back later. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, and yeah, it's beautiful. And then I think that website Disinfo was my springboard into Robert Anton Wilson, Terrence McKenna,
Yeah.
Genesis Peorage,
Yeah.
even Graham Hancock, like people like as far as like that
Right.
were all over that website.
Yeah.
Props to Richard Mesger for putting that together and having it going. That was some great stuff.
Yeah.
What he's doing these days.
He's talking a lot of politics on Twitter.
I'd see that's if you want to not think less of people, just don't have Twitter.
Don't
That's
have
what
Twitter.
I do.
That's exactly. I have to have Twitter. I
do.
will. I will circle back to this speech by Grant Morrison just to put a little cap on this
Sure.
episode. But people, it's available online. I'll have it in the show notes. Give it a watch. Turn the volume down before you click play, and then give it 2 seconds, and then turn the volume back up because it is an incredibly abrasive start.
That was definitely the catalyst for myself, and I think you've told me in the past. Young Doug's was had a little fire under his ass from that as well.
That was basically it. It was like after that, I had a string of ridiculous dreams. It was dreams and dreams and dreams. So that it's a very, very important thing to me.
And to me, it's like, well, if this dude does this, well, and everything he does tends to be awesome. Well, maybe
I didn't even know who he was. I had no idea.
Really? I went to that because I loved his comics.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that we came at it from two different highways, but road led to the same place. And it was just seeing him articulate these things where I was like, he fucking believes that? Like there's still people around that do this? And then from there it went and cascaded to, today.
Yeah, it's I honestly, the very first time I took home the DVD of Disinfo, I just put it on as a whim, and so I just suffered through. I actually found Douglas Rushkoff's opening very, very pertinent. It was really lovely. Find the others. That is now a phrase, like that. It's permeated the culture of the occult. Find the others.
Yeah.
But then this guy goes up on the scream super loud. I was like, what the fuck is this? I'm watching it at I literally had come home from working at a video store and I worked there late and it was like 1 a.m. I usually didn't go to sleep until 3:30 in the morning. So I was like, I'll put this DVD. I had the DVD for days and I was like, I'll put in disc 2. For people that don't know, back in the day, we used to watch videos on CDs.
Yep.
And before that, we had tapes. Anyways.
And you couldn't fit it all on one sometimes.
No, it's true. It's true. And so it's just been sitting around for days and I was like, I'll watch this too. And I just what the fuck is this guy talking about? And I just kept watching because let's watch the silly Scottish guy.
Right.
My family's Scottish, why not? I'm pretty good at hearing the accent. And then as he went talking, my brain slowly melted. It was just what is going on here?
Yeah, and the sense of urgency in his voice too, was what kind of drove it home for me. Is he's couldn't wait to tell you all this.
Yeah.
And you need to know it now.
And that's, I think, part of the appeal is hey, guess what? You can literally change your reality right now.
Yeah, you can go home and do this today.
Right now. Exactly.
Yeah, crazy. And that blew my mind. I was like, wait, I can too? Wait, me? Man, it was what an empowering speech.
Definitely. And from there, I watched that DVD, and then about 4 months later, the Disinfo company released a book called Book of Lies, which was a collection of magical essays that was compiled by Richard Metzger, one of the founders of Disinfo.com. And the very, very first essay, and literally the reason I bought that book, was a essay called Pop Magic by Grant Morrison. So I got this book, and it's Grant going through sigil magic. It's Grant going through how to invoke gods like Hermes, how to become like James Bond. It's a really wonderful introductory chaos magic. It's maybe one of the best encapsulations of chaos magic from just the turn of the 21st century. And it was from there that Grant Morrison said that he would be releasing an actual book on chaos magic. This never materialized, unfortunately. I think he went to write Super Gods instead.
Probably, yeah. Which
Yeah.
I can't recommend enough. If you guys like deep dives into, if you want to hear, if you want to hear Carl Jung talk about superheroes, then get Super Guts.
For sure. And it's one of those things. Would I recommend reading Pop Magic now? Yes, with a bit of a caveat of some stuff that I'm going to go through in like a little bit. But yeah, it's one of those things that is indelibly marked. That I'll remember Pop Magic
Sure.
for the rest of my life.
Totally.
It is a wonderful thing. So let us veer and talk about something that is a little bit unfortunate. Now, one of the reasons I have you on the show, Larry, is that you're a huge fan of Grant Morrison. I like Grant Morrison. I don't purchase. I'm not a comic book guy. I think a lot of people think that I'm a comic book guy because I know a shit ton about this other gentleman by the name of Alan Moore. I've
Yes.
basically read every single thing that Alan Moore does. I think Alan Moore is a wonderful writer.
Yeah,
We
absolutely.
just have to touch on it very briefly, a little bit. But Grant Morrison and Alan Moore, I'll just say this, very similar in some respects, very, very similar. A lot of the things, like Alan Moore will write a book about a serial killer. Grant Morrison will write a book about a serial killer.
Right.
These things happen. Things are said. They were within, the same time frame. Grant Morrison and Alan Moore, they really, really dislike each other. I don't, I think it's hatred. It's actual like hatred.
Yeah, it might be. Although to be fair, Grant's fairly gracious to Moore and Super Gods on several
He
occasions.
is. Yeah.
So, but I think that's like a a respect, real recognized, real type deal. You can't
Yeah.
downplay the guy's achievements. But I think when we were talking before, it was like I think they they come from a similar kind of stock, but they take it in different directions.
Correct.
To me, Morrison's more futurist. Morrison's more humans are amazing. Let's go forth and do great things. And Moore's more look how terrible we all are. And that's okay, but let's just like look at it and
Right.
so in it's almost like Moore to me would I see some of his work, even though it's like a comic book in color. When I think of it almost in black and white,
Okay.
almost traditionalist, almost like us. Like it's like in the Song Remains the Same movie for Led Zeppelin, how like each member of the band had like a different themed little fantasy scape, and then John Bonham's like driving a homemade car in a pig farm. Like that's like the two different like sensibilities, I'll say, between the two. And I think I said this a little kind of tongue-in-cheek and pithy to you, like but I feel like Moore feels like he transcended the medium of comics, and that his talent and his work will transcend the medium of comics. And Grant thinks that the medium of comics has transcended more, but I mean us, like
Yeah.
in that like we haven't fully tapped the positive aspects of the art form into a and Moore thinks that it's almost a dying art form,
Yeah.
and that he's leaving it a husk that's been for good reason, right? Like Moore was treated absolutely terribly by the editorial at DC.
Yeah.
Which is, I'm going to come out of my soapbox and say that's a trend that continues to this day. So get your shit together, corporations, and treat your creative staffs correctly. But
I don't know if that's ever going to happen.
yeah, it's probably not. But Moore, I see when I think of Moore, I think of a castle. When I think of Morrison, I think of a spaceship.
Okay.
If that makes sense. Like
Sure.
Moore comes from a I just pictured like the Saruman type wizard.
Right.
And
Oh, yes.
Grant's fucking Morpheus. Yeah, like it's so
Yeah.
it's Lord of the Rings versus the Matrix. It's
Right.
and it's also, I said to you before too, it's like what is it with like the British literati calling like wordly squabbles a war? I always hear it like the war of Alan Moore and
I
Grant. It's like
know.
it's not a fucking war.
They're just being catty with each other, and
Yeah,
it's still
it's fun.
ongoing.
And had Twitter been around then,
Oh,
it may have been a different story. But it's like, it's not even as like trite as like the Crowley Mathers war, but it's because arguably Grant and Allen are way more successful. But it's and I think that it was played up by the comic book media at the time too, to like kind of romanticize the two guys, and that's fine. And nothing, I have nothing against Moore. I just think he's a little I just smell like pipe tobacco and old dusty mahogany books when I read more, and that's great. That's fine. When I read Morrison, I feel like someone may have given me peyote. Like that's the difference between the two, and both are valid. Both are great. I love them both. In fact, like I plan on reading Jerusalem this winter if I
wonderful.
have
I
6 weeks. Great. Yeah. So, and I'm, I think they made each other better at times, and like, I think we saw great work come from it. But also I think Moore's kind of over it, and Moore was kind of like not necessarily, and he wasn't in the ring throwing as hard of punches as Moore was. Like Moore seemed to take, I'm sorry, as Morrison was. Morrison seemed to have some pretty personal digs.
Yeah.
Like, Alan Moore made one Watchman. Well, guess what? I make a Watchman a week. I was like, oh, Grant.
Yeah, I think there's one interview, and I'll have a link in the show notes. There's one interview with Alan Moore where he actually gets like, and I think I love Alan Moore, but he can be really mean. And there's this one interview by Alan Moore, and he just specifically is like, "This is the last time I'm going to talk about my thing with Grant Morrison," and he actually it's pretty devastating.
I'll look forward to reading that.
It's rough, and some homoerotic subtext gets thrown in there, and it's just like, you don't need to do that.
Yeah, that's
you don't need to do that, Alan.
Especially considering some of the stuff you've put out that could be regarded in such a way. Yeah.
I mean, Alan loves, like, he put out The Mirror of Love, which is one of the most amazing, like.
And was it Lost Girls? Was that the one he did with
Girls
his wife?
As well? Yeah, with Melinda Gibb. But it's two guys that are really great at what they do, who unfortunately, if they just put their shit aside, they would probably be very, they'd probably be friends. They'd probably be really cool to each other.
Here's the question I always wonder: is Alan Moore happy? You can say Grant Morrison is happy. He seems like a happy fucking dude.
Truthfully, I actually know somebody who lives in Northampton who sees Alan Moore all the time, and he says he's the loveliest man ever. They say he's out in the summer with his his grandkids. He's just another person in Northampton.
Sure.
But they say he always he doesn't dress up like you see him in the press photographs with the purple suit. He's got a black tank top.
Right.
And, he's
I think a lot of that too is just the way the media portrays them, and marketing is the fucking worst.
Yeah. It was actually after I released my episode on Alan Moore, and he was like, this person reached out to me. He's like, I see him around all the time. He's fine. He's fine. He's just a guy.
I apologize, person, for that, Mr. Moore. I apologize.
But anyways, that's all I want to say about this. It's really unfortunate. I think it's a very unfortunate thing because I doubt that they would work together, but I just think that it'd be one of those things. I would love to see the two of them just shake hands and be like, we're cool.
Right, share a stage, chat, something.
Yeah. But who knows? We're coming to the end here. Let's talk a little bit about the magical legacy of Grant Morrison. Now,
sure,
you probably have a bit more to say about this than I do, but what has Grant Morrison done with this idea of superheroes and Western mythology?
Well, I think that according to Grant, superheroes are Western mythology, and specifically American. He goes out in Super Gods and kind of makes it a point to say that it is almost more of an American phenomenon and a product of American post-war boom and capitalism and every little thing, the Wortham controversies where he tried to get comics banned, and Grant sees them for the refuge they are, and in the same way that ancient myths can articulate deep human truths of true human existence with the purpose of highlighting the positives and nurturing the more positive aspects of the human experience. The only thing doing that today on a mass level are the superheroes, and they're
everywhere.
They're larger. Yeah, you can't argue that they're larger than life. They're walking sigils. They're giant hieroglyphs. Mm-hmm. They're the culmination of the cave painting, right? They're the ultimate form of the juxtaposition of the written word and art, and in doing so, someone just by combining those two elements in sort of the cosmic anvil created these new archetypes.
If I say up, up, and away, in your mind,
Precisely, yeah.
immediately, it doesn't matter what age you are. If you're alive right now and living in the West, I say up, up, and away, you know who I'm talking about.
Exactly. Who do people know? Horus more or Superman? Right? Like they have become, like, I would almost even argue that the superhero trappings tell as much as the superheroes themselves, like the costumes, the logos, the villains. Like,
Yeah.
what do superheroes fight against? They don't fight against people, they fight against ideas. They fight against the
Schemes.
4-color memes that represent the travails of human existence. And
Right.
guess what? The fucking heroes win every time, and so can we.
Right.
And that's, I think, the inherent power that Grant tries to articulate, is that these can be interacted with on the in the chaos magic sense, right? The god form, the assumption of James Bond, the evoking Wolverine, if you gotta, you want to be tough. But it beyond that, you can interact with the mass sigils that are superheroes on the same level as you can interact with a Zeus or a Saturn, because they represent the same things. They're made of the same things. They come from the same places in our imagination, in our psyches, and they speak to the same places that are in our brains, right? Like, I use this example sometimes. Like, we have cannabinoid receptors in our brains, so and cannabis exists, so those two things are made to go together, right? We have these narrative receptors inherently wired into our consciousness, and that's where we respond the most to. So, comic book superheroes came out of that same mental miasma that created Zeus, or that interacted with whatever pantheon of gods you want to talk about. You can find a superhero that mirrors one of those gods,
Right.
delivers the same messages, has this, and that's not just because many of the superheroes were influenced by this iconography of these gods, but because they come from the same parts of the human fucking soul.
Yeah.
The older deities are almost out of touch, right? Superman has stopped a nuclear missile. Has Zeus? Like these old gods haven't had to face the same shit these new gods do, right?
Right.
Back in ancient Greece, there wasn't a single person in ancient Greece who could destroy the planet. There wasn't. Today, there's a few. So that's fucking scary. So we don't need Zeus to come and, turn into a goat and fuck some peasant lady. We need Superman to come and stop this nuclear bomb from blowing us up. And that's the power of the superhero, because they can do things these gods never had to. And they can interact with the now in a way that the rigidity of these old gods kind of can't. And I know that we're from the Patreon and the community, like there is going to say, wait, now we do, right? But I'm talking about the masses,
Right.
So I know that within our fucking gang of hooligans, we got some people that do, and that's awesome, and I love that. But what I'm saying is that Grant saying to the masses that this is a more accessible way for them to achieve the same gnosis, or the same feeling of connectivity, of enlightenment, of just not being fucking alone here,
Right.
the way that they did in the past. And I 100% agree, and will Novocaine knife fight anyone who wants to come at me with that sideways, because I know it's fun to denigrate like comic book form and superheroes because they're so annoyingly everywhere today, and I get that, but that's not their fault. That's the fault of the marketing machines. But that doesn't diminish the power of that, seeing that fucking Batman logo in the sky, or Superman, or just knowing what they represent. And that's what we should aspire to be. Like, no one wants to aspire to be Zeus. Like there's a lot of fucking weird baggage that comes with that shit. But
Right.
you could aspire to be Superman, because he has been there for the common dude. And I mean, that's a little reductionist, but and that's where I think the appeal comes in, is that interactivity and that accessibility, and that speaking to the travails of the modern person in a way that not a lot of other things can. And there's something to be said about the timelessness of it, right? Like, sure, the art may seem a little provincial if you try to like read a comic from the 40s, but the basic story beats are there.
Yeah.
And if in many cases were there first before they then got ported over to these other mediums and genres that people could see. So yeah, comic books are fucking awesome. Yeah.
They are. For sure. I think that when we were talking before making this episode, I was asked, like, should I read this Super Gods book? He said, read the first couple of chapters, and I did. And it reminded me of something that Grant brought up that I think is very important and very crucial. And that is something you brought up as well, Larry, is that in the introduction to that book, Grant talks about how the atomic bomb, the thing that has been with Grant his their entire life, the atomic bomb started off as an idea. Just the idea of being able to split an atom to cause massive destruction started off as an idea. But Superman did too. This idea of Superman. And one thing that I always will love about Grant Morrison, and it's true whenever you see any of his work, is that he is all for the enrichment and betterment of finding great, good ideas.
Yes.
Start with the good ideas. And that is something that I think is something that also translates into any kind of creative work that you do, even into like your magic and how you compose rituals.
Absolutely.
Best the ideas that you have, if they make sense to you, and if they are great ideas, they have a life of their own and an agency of their own. The two, it's funny, yeah. I'm about a 5-minute walk away from Schuster Street, which is named after Joel Schuster.
Yeah.
Like the person who came up with the design of Superman lives in where I'm from, right? Like, and he had no idea what he was doing. The two of them, I forget the name of the other. Oh shoot! Stiegel, right? Stiegel.
It's Siegel and Schuster, yeah.
Yeah, but when you talk to the people that knew these two, they knew they had a great idea. They were assured of their idea and how great it was. Just as Oppenheimer and the fucks in the laboratory knew that they had an idea as well. But the world is in dire need of great ideas, and they're there as well.
He said somewhere too, like where it's no longer enough to be clever.
No,
we need better ideas, not just not novelty of big ideas. And that's I guess if you had 2 words to describe Grant Morrison, it'd be big ideas.
Big ideas,
absolutely. And it's all from there. But I can't speak to how enriching it can be to interact with his stuff enough. I mean, it's even if you want to stick to just the mainstream superhero stuff, you'll find some subversion in there. You'll find some Gnosticism, a little Thelema here and there, so chaos magic, in an issue of X-Men. So and that you just got to look for it. And I'm sure most people who listen to this podcast will have an ear for such references and can kind of tune into that sort of current. And I'm excited to see where it goes from there. And hopefully, people who are on. If you are unfamiliar, hopefully this gives you a year or two's worth of some fucking awesome reading pleasure.
Definitely.
This podcast.
There's a bit of a diversion that I have with Grant, and it's particularly with this idea, though, of Grant does this thing where, and I get the need for it, they'll say that the idea of Ganesha is the same as the idea of Mercury, which is the same as the idea of Hermes. Right. And that is where I'm just like, Grant, I don't know about that. Just because there's a trail in nature doesn't mean that only one kind of animal walks on it. I don't know if that makes sense for people.
No, totally, yeah.
It's just that this correlation of 1 to 1 and to 1, and that these are only part of the human mind is where I kind of go.
Little too 777.
It's a bit too 777 for me, and as well, it's very odd because we just finished talking about Moore and Morrison. It's just I find that with these creative types, and there's particularly very successful creative types who say that they're magicians, and I get the news is that they're very creative, they find their groove, and they stick to their groove because it's a very successful formula, but they also don't allow themselves to be swayed by any new contrary information that they have. Sure. Or it's just reality tunnels all the way down. So this idea of psychologicalizing magic, which is what Grant does to an extent, it's just basically 100%. Says it's all in your head.
Yeah.
It's just, but to realize that there's magic in it is, I think, an interesting.
Duquette or Dukes? Which one had the book that was that you just have no idea how big your head is?
That's Duquette who said that.
Duquette, yeah. Tom O'Bedlam, actually, I think he uses Tom O'Bedlam to articulate that once. And It says, Tom's like kind of, him and Dane are going through Dane's initiation. And he says, your head's like mine, like all our heads, big enough to contain every god and devil there ever was, big enough to hold the weight of oceans and turning stars. Whole universes fit in there. But what do we choose to keep in this miraculous cabinet? Little broken things, sad trinkets that we play with over and over. The world turns our key and we play the same little tune again and again, and we think the tune is all we are.
Yeah. It's wonderful.
Jesus. My God. But yeah, and you know, I being the the crypto Discordian narcomancer that I am, I don't know. Like, I don't like to pick a side in that, because every day I waffle between the two, and I like that state. I like the I like saying I don't know, because it just gives me an opportunity to find out. And so I tend to, on some days when I read Grant, I enter in my mind, enters that reality tunnel, and then some days I read Wachter and it leaves that real, you know, it's and I think that's an awesome place to be in. Like, I like being in this where I fucking contain multitudes. Tell me, what am I gonna do? You know, I can't fake the funk. I'm not gonna ascribe, be a poser and say, you know, something that is what it isn't to me. But at the same time, I love hearing the varying reports of interactivity in this regards. Like, I know that there's seems to be a trend in a lot of like occult podcasters to go towards the Duquette model there and kind of promulgate that, which is okay, but they almost don't even mention the other possibility. And I think that you can't talk about A without also talking about B, you know? So I like the conversation. I like the discussion around it. And maybe I'll never land on either side. Maybe I will, but I just like the ride. And I think I probably have Grant to thank for that, just because I've immersed myself so much in their work over the years.
I do like how Grant, though, will say, because a lot of people do, particularly, I hope this doesn't sound like I'm punching downwards or any way, but a lot of people that read comic books, it's not the most social group of people. They're very insular, usually fairly introspective. But that Grant recognizes that enchanting what is already here is enough. And implying that there's meaning in what has already been given to us within even a materialist framework is, for some people, that's enough. That's cool. For people like myself who have experienced things that are like completely off the map, it's like, I know that there's more, and that's where the experimentation comes from. I understand the need to say that chaos magic proves that all magic is psychological, but that is completely incorrect. That was like a premise that is from like the late 70s, early 80s.
I also think too that when Warner Brothers is writing your checks, you tend to maybe inhibit your thoughts a little bit. You know, I'm not going to say that that's what happened, but you know, perhaps that does have something, especially in later years now. You know, I'm not sure. Like, you forwarded me that not Mesger, that Rushkoff podcast with Morrison. I haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, but I think unfortunately that does come into play sometimes, is those corporate overlords, and where we'd like to think that, you know, the more he still had to sell a TV show. When he did that interview, he was like, I still have to make people want to watch Brave New World, right? Exactly, right. But I think maybe the lesson therein is that Morrison's more of a springboard or an entry point than a destination, than an end point for many on you know, that are interested in these sort of topics. And that's, I mean, I think they fill that role phenomenally well.
I will say, though, this also about Grant Morrison. Alan Moore is kind of the person that we tend to think of as the magician, comic book writer, but Moore has not come up with some form of magic that we refer to this day, something like a hyper-sigil, which Morrison, which was what I will put Morrison above Moore for like that. the Hyper-sigil is just a wonderful process. And for people who have not experienced it, a really great way of interacting or learning about a Hyper-sigil, grab a copy of Aidan Wachter's Weaving Fate. There's a thing in there called the Black Book. It is basically diary writing to change your future. Some people I know have had amazing results from such an interaction. The Hyper-sigil belongs to Grant Morrison. That's his. Like that's his. That nobody's going to be like, I did before. It's like it's Grant.
Right. Yeah. You're not seeing too many new adherents to the Church of Glycon.
No, exactly.
There's not knocking down his door for that book.
Yeah, and I think just Grant's enthusiasm for this, just enchanting this world, is enough for people like myself who, when I watched his disinformation speech, or DisinfoCon speech, was a glimpse into a world that seemed impossible but alluring, and I wanted to become a part of that. So I basically, I don't know if Grant will ever listen to this, but I need to say thank you, Grant, because
100%.
This is what you are listening to, what people are listening to with their ears right now is because of Grant Morrison. Absolutely. And there's nothing that will take that away from Grant Morrison. He's a part of my life, indelibly branded on
Agreed.
me. And I love everything that Grant says. I disagree with a lot of what Grant says, but that's the best teachers are always the ones to disagree with.
Who wants to just hear fucking their own, inner thoughts echoed to them constantly all day? Give me someone I disagree with.
Yeah. And what about yourself, Larry? What is Morrison giving you?
A key to the door I always knew was there.
Right.
How's that? When I was a kid, I was always, like many of us, and I think like every fucking kid, let's be honest, feels like they're the only one going through what they're going through, and thinking that maybe the real value in the world is its weirdness, is humor, is its absurdity, is the ability to laugh at a funeral. I think that's what Grant's given me, is that he's shown me that all those thoughts of subversion and comedy and humor and satire that I've thought had power, he fucking showed me they do.
Right.
And and just showed me that there's that the whole 3-act plot structure of writing, that like this formulaic comic book plotting, TV plotting is a self-imposed prison, creative prison, and people like him and Moore and Gaiman and Milligan, it just showed that the real I keep saying the word voltage because that was like instilled in me when I was in college. I had a professor that said that was the word he used to describe writing and prose that makes you fucking feel something. He called it voltage. And I just I've always felt that Grant was the most I've ever felt on it. Like his pages crackle with as much like in the show 30 Rock is like a comedy line. Every line of dialogue is a comedy reference. It's rapid fire. And that's what Grant is with philosophy and esotericism, and just the fucking human experience. And like you said, if he ever listens to this, Grant, thank you so much for giving me the keys to the kingdom, the invisible kingdom. It just changed my life, and it made me not a clone, not some just the other. Like the other is what to seek, not to reject. Like, and that's I thank Grant for that. He showed me the value in subversion, and I fucking thank you.
Wonderful.
And thank you for allowing me to bloviate about him for nearly 2 hours.
It's amazing. I've wanted to talk to you. You're one of the we have a on the Patreon we have Discord server, and I always love reading everything they have to say on there, Larry. And
I appreciate it.
You're always the guy that comes in there. It's like, and another thing. And just I'm going to give you a perspective, all of you Hogwarts motherfuckers.
I occasionally am the old guy raising a fist and yelling at the cloud, but it's always out of love and adoration. Yes. And I love the little community there. Shout out to all the Patreon. We have a great time, and it's filled with a billion different perspectives that you can learn a little something from each one. And nobody's nobody's out of pocket there, which is great. And I'm happy to join the ranks of an illustrious and elite few who have made the podcast.
Yeah,
the likes of Michael Lux and Danny and them. So
wonderful.
Shout out. This is I've peaked.
No, you did stop it. Absolutely not. Yes, there's going to be some show notes to some of the things for Grant. We've got some of the interviews we mentioned, including the Disinfo. I'll have a great link to that again. But all of those are going to be available in the show notes at whatmagicisthis.com. Also available at whatmagicisthis.com, you will find a link to my Twitter account, my Facebook account, as well as my Instagram account. I'm fairly active on Twitter, so if you want to see some of the weird things that I'm tweeting about, that's the place to head to. Instagram, I'm being a little bit more active there. Facebook is just kind of like an afterthought, but I'll try to put stuff up there when it's available. Do you enjoy the show? Why not recommend it to a friend? And then they'll recommend it to a friend, and then they'll recommend it to a friend. All I'm trying to say is that if you really like What Magic Is This, tell somebody else. Share your love, because love makes the world go round. There were some pop songs written back in the 60s about such things, and I do believe it is true. But yes, it is greatly appreciated if you share your love for What Magic Is This, and then perhaps the word of mouth will cause more people to listen to this show, and everybody wins, because I think that what I'm talking about is pretty cool. Also, if you enjoy the show, please try to leave a review for me, either on iTunes or Spotify. I believe Spotify now has a star clicky thing. So if you can give me a star for every one of the fingers you have on your hand, hopefully you have all of your fingers. But if not, I'm not hating. That's cool. I had an uncle who only had 3 fingers, but even still, he would have given my show 5 stars. All I'm trying to say is that if you like the show, maybe share your love somewhere online. Let them know that you like the show, and particularly if you can write a couple of words about me on iTunes or on the Apple Podcasts app. Just say, I really like this show. It's pretty great, and Doug's pretty awesome. That would be highly appreciated. If you think that what I'm doing is pretty cool and you want to support the show, please join me on Patreon. That's patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. I have all kinds of exclusive material. For the new year, I'm basically going to have as much material on my Patreon as I do for the main podcast. I'm really trying to get people to sign up to the Patreon. It is only $7 a month. That is it. That is all I am asking. $7 American. That's like $9.50 Canadian. That's kind of the only currency I know. I think it's like something like £6 something, £5.50 groats. I think you guys still use groats in the UK, right? I'm pretty sure. So yes, it's I think it's like £5.50 groats. Anyways, I have full exclusive material there. I do episodes about saints like Saint Cyprian. I have an episode about Hermanubis. I did an episode about Baphomet, as well as a look into the kind of magic that I really like, things like necromancy and grimoire-based magic, as well as Solomonic magic. I just put out a 40-minute video going through this Solomonic knife and some of the knives that I use in my Solomonic magic, including a sword that I use for when I dabble with the Ars Goetia. It's pretty cool. All of that stuff is on Patreon. So that's it. That is my pitch. $7 a month. Sign up on the Patreon and you get so much more material from me. And truthfully, it is honestly my favorite stuff. That is where I go to really flex my muscles as far as telling stories and sharing the kind of magic that makes me really, really excited. So patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and click on any one of the many Patreon links that we have there. If you're not a huge fan of the donating every month kind of stuff, but you perhaps want to continue to support the show, I have a PayPal Me button all over whatmagicisthis.com. Click that button and you can donate any amount of money from $5 to $10 to $20 to $2,000 to $2,000 billion. It's a lot of money, but I know some people have it. Anyways, whatmagicisthis.com. Click on any one of the PayPal Me links. The PayPal money goes back to feeding this podcast and keeping it running. Everything with the podcast, from the equipment I record on to the making sure that I can pay for my internet, to which actually cut out during the production of this episode. I'm not too happy about that. I pay good money to have the best internet connection in Toronto, and every once in a while it still cuts. I don't get it. Canada's internet. Anyways, but anyway, what I want to say is that the PayPal stuff, all of that stays in keeping this show running. It keeps the fires on. That's all I'm trying to say. So if you're not a fan of the Patreon, PayPal me, the best way of doing that. But unfortunately, with the PayPal, you do not get access to any of the exclusive episodes that I do for the Patreon. Patreon is where I want to see you. That's where the good stuff is happening. And Larry is a very, very kind member of the Patreon. That is how he became to be a guest on today's show. He recommended again, man, you should do this episode about Grant Morrison. I'm going to be one voice in a choir. And then guess what? He's on the show. So that is one of the perks for being a Patreon supporter, is to become a guest on What Magic Is This. If you suggest something that is really cool to be covered, that is the hope, if you so desire. So another reason why the Patreon is the bee's knees, the cat's pajamas, the cat's meow. Is that one of the I don't really know all of them, but anyways, yes, Patreon is the best place. And you also get to interact with myself and Larry on the What Magic Is This Discord that is only available to the Patreon supporters. Another way of supporting the show, besides Patreon and besides the PayPal me, is the merch. Head to whatmagicisthis.com, go to the menu, click on the merchandise button there, and you have access to t-shirts, to hoodies, to mugs, stickers, notebooks. Guys, the notebooks, they look so good. And people have been showing me the notebooks. They look amazing. It's create your own grimoire, but just, yes, the What Magic Is This logo is on it. It's pretty cool. Imagine when, after you die and 300 years in the future, when they dig up your they find your grimoire, and it's got What Magic Is This on the cover, and it's all your crazy spells in there that you learned from being a Patreon supporter of What Magic Is This. It's gonna be so cool. But anyways, all of that merchandise, so much stuff, wall posters, tote bags, mugs, did I mention stickers, fridge magnets, t-shirts, it's all there. So show people how much you love the show. And when they stop you in the street and say, hey, what's on your shirt there? You say it's the best podcast around ever in the history of podcasts. Better than even that podcast about that guy who killed some other guy. I think that's like every podcast these days. Anyways, all of these things, from the show notes to the Twitter account to the merchandise to the Patreon to the PayPal, all of that is available at whatmagicisthis.com. Larry, thank you so much for being on the show to cap off 2021. We've been recording for 2 hours and 15 minutes. It's felt like we've
flew by.
We've literally just started talking, but thank you so much for joining me to talk about the one and only Grant Morrison. There is nobody else like Grant Morrison.
Nobody. And we couldn't handle it if there was.
No, exactly. So
yeah. Hey, man, if I'm ever up in Toronto, I'm crashing on your couch.
Definitely. I've got a futon for just we can put it down. We're riding in style.
I'll sleep. I could sleep on a fire hydrant.
Oh, very well. I hope that if sometime in the future I'd actually come back on the show, Larry, you would, because this has been such
100%. I think I'm going to come on even if you don't ask me. So.
Oh, perfect. There we go.
Awesome.
And that's it, everybody, for this episode of What Magic Is This. Come on back. We're going to talk about more of this biff, pow, wham, thok.
Get them.
Stuff that we like to call magic. Until then, I want each and every one of you to stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous. We will talk at you soon. Can we get a goodbye from you, Larry?
Everybody out there, have a wonderful 2022 and live by the 4 words I try to: have fun, harm none. Holler at your boy.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody. We will talk at you soon. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.